Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us.
Everyone, welcome back to another episode of Socializing Security. How are you doing, Brian?
Doing well, Milou. It's, I think we every time we're like, hey, we're in a hectic phase, but hopefully it'll get over soon. And then we say that the next week, and then we say that the next week. So
Just busy.
I should just give up
busy.
trying to hope.
Yeah, I keep looking forward to moving forward. I'm very much in like a policy and procedure drafting phase at work, so very like documentation heavy. So I'm always glad when we get on because it's like a different type of energy than just poring over documents all day.
Yeah. It's a good break to have a good conversation. So looking forward to today's.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation today because we're really going to talk about cyber resiliency. And I think this is a topic that Brian is very familiar with. I think in his day job, this is probably a talk track that is burned into his brain. So I think we'll definitely pull on his expertise here, which is great because I think in the compliance space, I don't really necessarily feel like I've had a bunch of exposure to the brand of cyber resiliency. I think it incorporates a lot of factions of an information security program. So I'll be curious to kind of pick your brain a little bit as we really start to talk about like what does it mean to be cyber resilient and what is cyber resiliency when we're building it out and explaining it to definitely people that are less technical.
Yeah. And I should start this conversation with a disclaimer that we're not usually doing, which is that this is kind of my day job is building out messaging and selling cyber resilient solutions. I will leave it to an exercise to everybody that listens, watches this to go look at LinkedIn and you can figure out who I work for and connect the dots. It's not a secret by any means. I'm not here to represent that company.
I was about to say, but you're here representing yourself and your personal experience and not the brand that you work for.
Correct. Yep. So this is a passion of mine. This is one of those, do what you love type of jobs. So I'm lucky to be able to talk about this on a daily basis. And it is an interesting term that's getting used a lot, and it's necessarily kind of confusing right now. So definitely looking forward to this conversation to help people maybe understand a little bit better. And I will keep it as independent as I possibly can.
Well, it's simply something, you're passionate about, and even better if you get to do it in your day to day. But I guess when we're like talking about, just start on the basics. Like, what do you feel like cyber resilience means at the moment in the market, and how are you kind of hearing people explain it?
Yeah, and like I said, it is a new-ish term in the market. It's very much in that space of everybody's kind of latching onto it as a term, but there's no real hard and fast definition. So there's a lot of posturing as to what the definition should be. Not an area I'm unfamiliar with, having been through the craze of the hyper-converged infrastructure market. Yeah, I got to help define that market to some extent as well. So personally, I love this kind of space because I'm a big thinker. I don't, as I put together messaging, I sometimes think about it beyond what my company can do, because that helps me put it into context of, as a customer, you may be looking at cyber resilience. Cyber resilience encompasses all of these things. I can help you with this piece, but I want you to understand how this piece relates to everything else, because every organization is an ecosystem of products, and I have yet to run across any organization that was truly just a single product managing the entire infrastructure. So yeah, as we talk about this term, I always start my presentations and conversations with kind of, here's the definition I use. I'm going to put that definition aside as my day job definition, and really, for me, when I look at cyber resilience, that term is being used to kind of describe how you handle a cyber attack. And it's not like, oh, this is your response plan. It's greater than that. It's more about measuring how well you can resist, recover from, deal with, prepare for that cyber attack. And it kind of comes down to, you have to accept that failure is going to happen. It's a chaotic environment. There's this concept of normal accidents that says any complex system with tight integration, which is a pretty good description of most data centers these days, is inevitably going to fail because those connecting pieces, those internal pieces, everything breaks down. Your car is always going to break down at some point. And so you should, theoretically be squirreling a little bit of money away each month in order to prepare for that. Cyber resilience is kind of that same concept. It's assuming that failure is going to happen. It's accepting the fact that failure in a cybersecurity context is a breach. A breach is going to happen. With as many breaches as we've seen over the last 10 years and how all of us just joke that, my data is not private anymore because it's already out there multiple times. We all that doesn't mean that people haven't been trying to protect that data. It just means that no protection is 100%. And with enough effort, you're going to get to it.
Can you clarify that part of it a little bit about what you mean? If there's a weakness as a breach, did I kind of misinterpret that? Or
no,
is that a weakness?
Well, it's more the fact that in a complex system, there are weaknesses, and you aren't going to be able to address every single weakness that you have because it is complex. There is a lot of moving parts and pieces. And any one of those that gets a little bit wobbly has the potential to wobble the next piece, which has the potential to wobble the next piece, which eventually one of them, falls off the axis or comes completely detached from the other pieces and things fail. I mentioned normal accidents. That's actually a theory in a book that was written originally back in the 70s. The author's Perrow, Perrow. And he looked at the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident, later updated it in the early 90s based on the Challenger accident. Looked at a whole bunch of accidents as well, many that are big and famous and some that I'd never heard of. And his investigation said that, if it's a complex system, things are going to fail. Dominoes are going to fall. And since they're so tightly coupled, one domino falling is probably going to hit another domino, which may hit another domino. And that level of interaction, we can never predict. We can never truly understand it because it is so complex. And, you apply that to cybersecurity and, your attack surface is huge. And quite frankly, the more security products you put in your environment, the more attack surface you introduce. It's a bit of a conundrum, but it's inevitable. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. Use less security tools is not what Brian said. It's a matter of making sure that things are connected properly, that you put in firewalls, not the edge devices that we use to protect our network, but the concept of an actual firewall in a building is to say we want to contain these two parts of the building away from each other. And if a fire breaks out on the right side, the left side isn't going to catch fire because it would have to get through that firewall, which is why, when a fire happens, you've got to close those doors so that the fire can't get through. And making sure that those different systems can't take each other down is the most important part in a complex system. And that's where we get concepts of microsegmentation, for example. So in that case, you do put a network firewall in between two parts of the network to make sure, or even around a single application, or even around different parts of an application to ensure that they can't take each other down and the lateral movement is reduced.
Yeah. I'll ask from your perspective, do you feel like cyber resiliency is kind of a new term for disaster recovery and planning?
No. The way I like to put it is that the efforts that go into it that we've been doing for disaster recovery for the last 10, 20 years, depending on what industry you're in and how long you've been looking at it, are very similar as a part of cyber resilience. So my day job, we focus on several different aspects of cyber resiliency. One of the more important ones is cyber recovery and being able to, hey, these 5 machines got infected with malware. We managed to stop it. It didn't spread beyond that, but let's get those back up and running. That's where your DR plan can align. It's never going to be 100% because generally disaster recovery is, we've got a crater instead of a data center. What are we going to do now? Whereas cyber recovery is much more nuanced. It's actually much more difficult than a disaster recovery because, one, you may not know what the blast radius was. You may not know what all got affected. And so one, you've got to assess that. You may be able to recover 2, 3, 4, 5, a handful of files maybe, and be done and ready to go. but you always have that question in your mind: is it floating around in there somewhere else? So yeah, a cyber recovery could be, hey, we're just going to restart the whole thing over there. But you also have to account for, well, what if it's been hiding in your backups? Because that is not an uncommon thing these days, because they will attack the backups directly. And so how do you deal with that? Have you gone back far enough to make sure that it's not sitting there lying in wait? Because that has been documented many, many times, that restore, oh, we're infected again. Restore, oh, we're infected again. Restore, oh, and it just goes on and on until you find one that doesn't get reinfected. Guess what? That was 2 months ago. Can you afford to lose 2 months of data on that system? That's something you need to know before the disaster happens. So a lot of these concepts are similar to disaster recovery, the understand what you have, understand what you can afford to lose, all those types of concepts, but really much more nuanced, but honestly should all be part of one big giant business continuity planning document or plan. It's not going to be a single document, because a lot of similarities exist in there. And it's not just about the digital assets. It's not just about the data and the servers and the systems and the networks. It's where are the people at? How do they get access to the system if it's somewhere else? These days with Zoom and everything, and remote work is less of a concern than it used to be. But back in my admin days, we had a workforce relocation space. We had a place where they made it clear that these groups of people that are critical to the operations of this business go to this location. We'll tell you when, but no, that's where you need to be, probably within a couple of hours after us notifying you that there's been a disaster. And because there was no concept of walk around with your laptop all the time, you could log it from anywhere. So that's less of a concern these days than it used to be, though some organizations still have that kind of concept. So yeah, a lot of similarities.
When they invoke their BCP, right? If they are an in-person workforce, then usually the business continuity plan will say, in the case of an emergency, we will activate the remote workforce. And so basically they'll give people temporary permission to potentially VPN in to the system from their personal networks at home, as opposed to working in an office.
Yeah. And we saw examples of that during the pandemic when lockdowns
Yeah, we all
first started
invoked our
happening.
BCP. From an audit perspective, there are certain controls that you can basically prove real life evidence. And I think everybody used the COVID pandemic as an example of a live invocation of the business continuity plan. I think we honestly used it for at least 2020, if not 2021, because it was still a very real issue during those audit seasons.
Yep. And that's one of many parallels. Unfortunately, cyber recovery plans are a lot harder to test. Our
Right.
plans are a lot easier to test because they're pretty cut and dry, again, what the blast radius is. In fact, really mature companies tend to, every 6 months or every quarter, some get, I think going anything less than a quarter is a little too much, but they will literally just fail over, and then they'll run in production for the next 3 to 6 months, and then they'll fail over back. And so they're constantly testing that.
Yeah, I think quarterly is best practice for failover events, and also backup restore testing and stuff. But obviously every company's policy and program is different. But I think the baseline is just quarterly testing. But I like the idea of actually just switching full over, failover, and then, because I've seen it sometimes where they just fail over and they say, yep, it works, and then they switch back. But I like the idea of kind of alternating between the sites.
Yeah, and that's a lot harder to do with the cyber recovery scenario, because, again, it may not be the whole thing. A partial failover is actually more tricky than a full failover, and that's a topic for another day as to why that is, because it gets really, really technical really fast. But so yeah, there's a lot of parallels.
When we start to think about then building out a cyber resiliency program, I don't want to call it a plan. It incorporates the business continuity plans, incident response, disaster recovery, backup strategy, emergency response, right? Also your personnel, who's activated. I guess, what are the other types of things that fall into it?
Yeah. So, cyber resilience actually, to me, ends up being, if you're familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework, that's where a lot of my mind goes to, because it is such a real thing to hold on to. To me, it's primarily about the response and the recovery phases. Obviously, governance plays in there. Governance plays in every phase. And the program for cyber resiliency really probably should exist in the governance phase itself. But the actions that you would take and the invocation of your cyber resilience plan, or plans, I should say, because it's usually multiple, is usually going to play into the response and recovery. A little bit of detect, because everything starts with detect on the back half of that framework. So when we look at the cyber resilience planning, I mentioned cyber recovery as one of those disciplines that exists within there. Having your response plans, that's a big part of cyber recovery and is something that should be done ahead of time. Making sure you've got the backups that will still be there, making sure they're impenetrable, making sure that they're, immutable. There's all sorts of words that different companies use around there, because they all are trying to spin cyber resiliency, cyber recovery, impenetrable backups in ways that make sense to them. Things like risk. How do you assess your risk? To me, that's kind of one of the first steps of cyber resilience is you got to understand your risk. And, we've had that conversation with Steve Sims in the past about knowing the basics, and the basics end up being inventory, know everything that you have. Next level from that ends up being, what are the vulnerabilities? What are the risks? And I'm not just talking about the CVEs that you have in your environment that you need to go patch, but your risk to, what about that salesperson that's been downloading a report out of Salesforce every single month that has all sorts of customer PII in it? That's a risk. Like having that sitting around in their OneDrive or their Google Drive or somewhere where anybody could potentially have access, that's a risk. That shouldn't be sitting out there. So being able to clean that kind of stuff up to reduce the attack surface, to reduce the blast radius of these things belongs in there. So knowing what you have, knowing who has access to it. So there's all sorts of them. I'm still honestly trying to figure out what those different disciplines are and how best to term those, and to acknowledge the fact that it's a wide ranging thing. Again, security these days is ecosystem. It's a team sport when it comes to different products, and because there's a lot of elements to it. There's a really cool kind of mind map of the different disciplines of cybersecurity. And it's crazy how many there are, how they interrelate, and the fact that there's no chance. Some of them are individual vendors focusing on that one thing, and they have a huge book of business. Much less anybody that claims that they can do all of them is a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, another area that I've seen really become more important and offered a little bit more frequently is instant response retainers. I'm seeing a lot of consulting firms as well as cybersecurity firms also just offering a pay for this amount of hours, and in the worst case, in the case of a cyber attack, we'll basically have teams ready to deploy to do the forensics, to stop, do the initial analysis. So you're basically paying for a retainer for instant response, which I think ties into this entire thought of do you have a budget for an instant response retainer? Is this something that you're ready to spend right now? Or have you figured out at least who you would call in the worst case, right? That's part of a business continuity plan is who are your lawyers? Who are your forensics? Who would you call in the worst case? And making sure you just at least have their phone numbers properly written down. That's, I think, where you could start. But I think now I'm seeing that there are organizations that are offering hey, we'll have support ready to deploy basically immediately if you have this on retainer. Mind you, personally, I do think for smaller organizations, knowing which companies have those retainers, most likely in the worst case that you do have a critical event, they probably could find resources for you. My guess is they'll just cost more than they would have if you had paid it upfront ahead of time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's another parallel with, you mentioned business continuity plans, having somebody to help you. There are vendors out there that provide some of those services. And so that's definitely something to evaluate different vendors on is, if I get attacked, what are you going to do? Do you give me anything to help? Do you have a team that will help? What's the support structure look like? Can I call in and create a ticket ahead of time? Are you going to get on the phone with me? Those types of things are things to evaluate when you're evaluating different vendors within cyber resilience. Again, that's a wide range of vendors. Incident response is the common one. I've heard that cyber insurance is oftentimes requiring that and sometimes giving you a limited choice.
Or you might get a deduction in your cyber insurance plan. So something I've seen clients and customers look into is looking at, if we pay for the retainer, does our annual premium on our cyber insurance go down a little bit so we can potentially justify the cost of paying for this retainer upfront? There's like another way to do it about being a little bit more creative. Cyber insurance actually, I think, falls squarely into this entire discussion, right? Because like, do you have some shared risk with an insurance provider in the case that you do have a cyber attack? And, do you have sufficient coverage? I think pulls into all of this as well.
Yeah. I mean, part of the risk math that I mentioned before that is part of figuring out your cyber resilience is how you deal with that risk. Do you try to solve it? Do you try to obfuscate it? Hey, I know that system is risky. I'm going to put more firewalls around it and try to mitigate that risk. Or do you shuffle it off to somebody else? Do you say, hey, that is going to be your responsibility. This is what we do in the United States. This is what we do with our homes. This is what we do with our cars, is we say, hey, insurance, I'm going to give you a little bit of money each month, maybe not a little bit. But if I wreck my car, then you will take care of me in that situation. Perfect example. We had a hailstorm come through this summer. One of our cars got totaled that was sitting out. They treated us very well. I was very happy with our insurance because they essentially said, hey, we're going to total it. It costs more to repair than it is worth on its own. So we'll either give you money for whatever little value is left, or we'll buy it from you for a little bit more. And that way we don't have to cover it anymore. Essentially, they don't want to have to cover it. So we sold our car for more than it was probably worth, more than we could ever get on the market. Same thing with our roof. Like a real world situation is when we got our shingles replaced, if we go with a certain class of shingles, they give us a discount on our home insurance, and it was not insignificant. So it was definitely a good option there. So that definitely plays into all of this. And again, knowing who to call in that moment and not being reliant on your production systems to be able to get to that information is key.
Yes. One of the things, it seems really simple, is that I feel like in the compliance space, we're always like, don't download documents. And we want to avoid people saving local files on their like local machines as opposed to like in cloud storage. One of the things that I actively encourage team members to download locally is a copy of their business continuity plan, to making sure that the people that are responsible actually have that information and can access it in the worst case that your cloud hosting provider is down and you can no longer access your files, because then it's really hard to pull emergency contact if you don't have it. So those are small things that obviously incorporate part of the larger discussion and some of the like tricks of the business of being like, hey, normally I would tell you don't ever download anything locally, except if you are a part of an emergency response team, you actually do need to have this information available locally, or even print it out. Obviously that would assume you'd be home, but there are different things to think through with this. I think we've provided a pretty big baseline. It sounds like a lot of the core components are just starting with, what do we have right now, right? Like identifying what are your critical systems, what are potential risks, weaknesses, and then starting to define out, do we have a backup strategy? Do we have a disaster recovery response plan? Can we test it? How frequently? Have we thought through business continuity planning? Do we have cyber insurance? Are we thinking about, do we have an incident response retainer? And do we know who to call in the worst case something did happen? As well as then starting to think about, okay, like, could we actually withstand a cyber attack, and really starting to do that? I would assume there are probably also not only tools that you can use, but also baseline. You can do business continuity planning audits if you want to get to that level. Large organizations absolutely do.
Yeah, and that's where exercises like tabletop exercises come in. Is a way for you to test, do our procedures work? Do people know who to call in the heat of the moment when X happens? But that's obviously not an audited type thing, though it could be an interesting space to do some level of auditing based on tabletop exercises. The whole concept of tabletop exercises really fascinates me.
Basically simulation, just for those of you that aren't familiar with the term. It's like you're going to walk through the plan a particular scenario, invoke it. Ideally, you don't tell people ahead of time, so it's a real test of like, can you get in contact with them? And then usually you do evidence the fact that it happened in audits, but I'm not sure about whether or not. A lot of times, actually, companies actually work with audit firms to do the tabletop exercises. They bring in third-party experts to walk through the scenarios.
Yeah, and it's a non-technical thing, so it's not to test, how fast does your failover plan work. It's more focused on the people, procedure, communication side of things. Hence hence the phrase tabletop, because you oftentimes are just sitting around a table discussing it. Okay, so this thing happened. What are you going to do? And the team has to, talk through it. And, well, I'm going to walk over to my bookshelf and I'm going to pull that big giant binder out. I'm going to flip to page 1 that says, what to do in an emergency. And then, maybe you've probably got those books because you're doing a tabletop exercise. So now you can actively go through it with the team and say, okay, yeah, and at this point, I'm going to call this person over here. And the person that guides you through it, will guide you through it. They'll be like, okay, cool. You did everything right there. Let's fast forward a few hours. And now you've been able to do these things. So it's a fascinating study on how process can work. And I'm a process nerd, so maybe that's why it speaks to me so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely like tabletop exercises are great, especially if people are engaged, right? I think it's a part of this larger discussion. I really do think it's great that companies are really starting to focus on beyond just like do our backups work? And do we know who to call? And now it's really starting to think, are we being strategic about this? Have we really thought through the scenario of, in the worst case, have we really thought through as many angles as possible? Obviously, you can't have a perfect plan. It's impossible. We just cannot forecast all of the potential things that could happen in the case of a cyber attack. But thinking through more of them, and I think also creating a culture around we want to be cyber resilient and we want to build this out within our organization and prioritize it. And unfortunately, spend a good amount of money on it. A lot of these things do cost, extra, like even just getting backup set up for organizations can be expensive. So thinking through, what is the budget for your leadership team to buy into, also making sure that you can say that you really are cyber resilient.
Yeah, I like to usually talk to people about cyber resilience in the framework of a maturity model. And again, this is something I'm still kind of figuring out. Would love to hear people's thoughts on this, because it is something I'm actively trying to figure out what all the right pieces are. But really, it's this concept of you start with nothing. Maybe you have backups, but you haven't tested them. You don't have a business continuity plan. You don't know what to do in the case of an emergency. Most people aren't in that phase. And you slowly go through a bunch of different things. And this is where those disciplines, I need to get the disciplines kind of nailed down, because each one of those disciplines has a spectrum on them. And each company has to define what that spectrum is for them. On the backup side of things, is having backups good enough? Or do we need to make sure that every system has a backup that is less than 24 hours old and is in a situation where we always know it's going to be there and it's been tested multiple times and so on and so forth? Each company is going to be different on that spectrum across each of those disciplines. And so once you've figured that piece out, then you can sit down and start saying, where do we exist on each of those spectrums? And are we closer to 0? Or are we closer to 10 on that spectrum? And then for each of those different disciplines, you start to identify, okay, what's the next step? How do we move forward? Which one is the priority? Which is the one that we feel is the most important to our organization? And then, start to programmatically start addressing those and start slowly inching your way up the hill, much like the old Price is Right game. I don't know if it still exists or not. I don't watch the show anymore. Of the mountain climber, where he climbs up the mountain, and certain activities will get you certain distance up that hill. And there's really no summiting the hill truly, because just like the earth, it's always shifting. And so your environment's always changing. There's new applications, there's old applications being pulled out, there's new types of data being brought in. There's new threat actors out there with new vulnerabilities, with new attack vectors. There's new employees and old employees coming in and out of the organization. Like you are not building cyber resilience on solid ground. It's constantly shifting underneath of you. And so getting to the most mature point is not well, cool, we can walk away. We never have to worry about cyber resilience again. It has to be programmatized within the organization to constantly readdress it. Just like business continuity planning, just like disaster recovery, you've got to update it on a more frequent basis than anybody's probably doing it. Because every week somebody is leaving the organization, somebody new is coming into the organization. And so if your contact list isn't updated, you're falling back down in your maturity there. But that's how I like to think about it. So there's a lot of things that go into it, that it exists on a spectrum, and each company needs to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, I think I definitely took away some food for thought about thinking through. I'm actually currently building out a business continuity program for an organization I'm working with. So this is really great timing for me, but thinking through what are the components that go beyond the documentation and really think through about if we could step back and think about it more holistically, what does it look like for our organization to be cyber resilient? And what does that mean for our ability to withstand a cyber attack? So I appreciate you kind of walking us through that. And as you continue to mature the framework around it, definitely keep us posted. Maybe we'll have to do a follow-up of kind of where you landed of, is there a checklist or is there a program and a benchmark that organizations can start scoring against so that we can start to see like how mature are they?
Yeah, for sure. And everything we've talked about was very theoretical on purpose. I'm purposely trying not to be too prescriptive just because there is no right answer. It's much like the NIST cybersecurity framework. It's like you've got to adapt all this to your own organization. We're not going to tell you how to do all this. Yeah. So I'm really thinking about it from that perspective as well.
Yeah, one size does not fit all when it comes to cyber resiliency.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thanks, Brian. We'll catch you on the next episode. We appreciate everybody listening in, and thanks for socializing with us.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.